Welcome to Yellowstone Story. Every story holds a lesson, a twist, or a spark of inspiration. Here, we dive into gripping tales, some heartwarming, some shocking, but all unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. My name is Camilla, and my life changed in an instant when I decided to uncover the dark secrets within my father's company. This is the story of how I found myself in the center of a ruthless game, where every mistake is a step toward losing everything you once loved and believed in. I took a glass of wine, looking at my father across the table in our favorite restaurant. "Dad, I want to work in the company Incognito for a while," I said, feeling how important this moment was, let's say, to find out what's really going on inside. My father looked at me intently. His gaze remained as strong and confident as ever, despite his age and the gray that had completely covered his hair. He leaned back in his chair, and I could feel his full attention on my words. He didn't answer immediately, but there was a firmness in his voice that I recognized from all the decisions he had ever made. "You know, I was expecting this conversation," he finally said. "I thought I might suggest it myself, but you beat me to it." I leaned forward slightly, and his words made me pause and think about the significance of this step. He continued, "Do you understand why this is important?" I nodded, confirming that I understood. Everything should be in the hands of those who truly understand what's going on. My father's agreement meant a lot to me. I suggested starting in the sales department, on a basic position with no privileges. He agreed. "Tomorrow I'll call Mr. Smith, my deputy, and tell him to expect a new employee, Monica." I couldn't help but smile inwardly, but I also felt strengthened by the decision. Let it be Monica. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, assessing my new look. A simple white blouse, dark blue skirt, minimal makeup, hair neatly tied back. Nothing like I usually choose for myself, but it was necessary to start this new phase. When I arrived at the office, I was greeted by Miss Serafina, the secretary of the deputy director. From the moment she saw me, I could feel her evaluating me, and I immediately knew she didn't like my appearance. As soon as the door to the office closed, she quietly hissed, showing that she wasn't about to hide her dislike. "You're nobody here, and you won't be called anything," she began to show me my place. "You'll do what you're told and stay silent." I felt my cheeks flush with anger, but I tried not to show it. In fact, I knew this was just the beginning. Deep inside, I was already ready to face whatever lay ahead. Miss Serafina didn't give me a moment's rest and immediately continued. "Mr. Smith is busy right now. I'll bring you up to speed," she said, not paying attention to my thoughts. She threw a stack of papers onto the table. "For starters, you'll go through these documents, and everything should be ready in an hour." I sat down at the table and began sorting through the documents. "How do they even work here?" I thought to myself as I saw the utter chaos in the files. They were a complete mess, and I didn't like it at all. The day dragged on endlessly. Serafina kept finding reasons to nitpick. The coffee wasn't hot enough. The papers were improperly arranged, or something else. I could feel my irritation building up. In the evening, sitting in my car, I called my father, unable to hold my feelings any longer. "Dad, this is going to be harder than I thought." "What, you want to quit already?" I could hear a slight smirk in his voice. "No." I shook my head stubbornly, trying to push away the failures. Now I'm sure I want to get to the bottom of it. Looks like there's a lot to fix in the company. "That's my daughter," my father said, his voice filled with pride. "Keep me updated, but remember, not a word about our agreement to anyone." I hung up the phone and took a deep breath, feeling the weight on my shoulders. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I was determined to figure out what was really happening in my father's company. The next 2 weeks turned into a real test. Mr. Smith returned from his business trip, and I met him exactly as my father had described. A man in his 50s with well-groomed mustaches and a habit of looking down on everyone. He looked me up and down and finally spoke. "So, this is our new recruit?" I hope Miss Serafina has already explained to you the rules of behavior in polite society. I lowered my eyes, trying to play the part of humility. Yes, Mr. Smith. I understand everything. He smirked, his gaze skeptical. And I knew the trials had only just begun. Well, he said. We'll see. I was greeted differently in the sales department. Nora, an exhausted woman, waved her hand toward me without looking up from her work. I heard her voice, "Sit down, girl, I'll show you what to do." And she went on with her tasks. But Chris, the overconfident manager with coffee stains on his tie, didn't have a chance to grab my attention. He immediately offered to help me. His words were delivered with his usual confidence. "Listen, newbie, how about I tell you everything about our company? Maybe tonight at a cafe?" I responded, not giving him a chance to continue. "Thanks, but I'd rather focus on work." With each passing day, the picture of what was really happening in the company became clearer. Mr. Smith and Serafina had turned the office into a real feudal castle, where there was no room for independence. Every morning started with a meeting, during which the deputy director tirelessly scolded employees for the slightest mistakes. "What are these numbers?" His shout echoed through the office. He waved the reports around, then his gaze shifted to me. "You've all degraded, and you, newbie, why are you smiling? Think you're the smartest?" I silently swallowed the reproach, unwilling to respond. But inside, everything was boiling, especially when I saw Serafina comforting the boss in his office after the meeting, massaging his shoulders. The salvation for me came in the form of my friendship with Armin, a quiet girl from accounting. She had a sharp mind and remarkable work ethic, and I immediately realized that I could trust her. One day, during lunch, she whispered quietly to me, "They say the old man is retiring soon, and Mr. Smith is already dividing the company." I became interested and couldn't hold back my curiosity. "What do you mean?" Armin sighed and continued, speaking softly so no one could hear us. "He was boasting to Serafina yesterday that now, finally, he will get everything he deserves. He'll fire half of the staff and cut salaries." She paused and added, "And there are strange documents appearing." I've seen ones like that in accounting. That evening, I sat in my apartment, going through the notes on my phone. Everything I saw painted a bleak picture. Employee bullying, signs of financial fraud, blatant nepotism, and the complete confidence of the deputy director in his impunity. Suddenly, a message from my father popped up. "How's it going? Worked today?" I replied without thinking, "We'll talk on Sunday." "Of course, just stay safe and be careful," he wrote back. I smiled, realizing they had no idea who was really behind this quiet mouse they were tormenting. But I knew the time hadn't come yet. First, I needed to gather all the evidence and figure out who I could really trust. The next day, Mr. Smith called me into his office after work. The room was dimly lit, with only the faint light of a desk lamp illuminating his face. He reclined in his leather chair, swirling a glass of cognac in his hand. "Sit down, Monica," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "I've been wanting to talk to you for a while." I cautiously lowered myself onto the edge of the chair, feeling an uncomfortable pressure around my throat. "You know, I've been watching you," he continued with a smirk. "You're not as simple as you pretend to be, and I appreciate smart women." His words made me uneasy. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the way he spoke said it all. "Big changes are coming soon," he said, not breaking eye contact. "The old man is leaving, and I have big plans for this company. And you might find a place in them, a special place." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. Did he really just call my father the old man? "Mr. Smith, you're suggesting..." My voice wavered slightly. He smiled smugly. "I'm offering you more than you could ever achieve," he continued. "Of course, in return, loyalty and special attention to my person will be required." There was a knock on the door, and Serafina poked her head into the office. She looked determined as she said, "Darling, "I've brought the documents," but upon noticing me, she immediately froze. Her gaze turned icy. "Slut, so this is what you're doing here?" she spat, not holding back. Mr. Smith grimaced, clearly irritated, and responded, "Serafina, calm down. We're just talking." Serafina flushed red, her eyes filled with fury. "Talking?" Her voice sounded like a storm was brewing. "Get out of here!" She directed her aggression toward me. I quickly rushed out of the office, not wanting to provoke any further conflict. In the restroom, I felt a wave of nausea. The disgust was overwhelming. "My God, Dad, what has your company turned into?" I thought, my heart heavy with bitterness and hatred. This was no longer a place where I could work with pride. It was something completely different, and I didn't like it. The next day, Serafina launched a full-scale war. I was buried under pointless tasks, not allowed to take a lunch break, and she constantly found reasons to nitpick everything. The criticism became unbearable. In the evening, Serafina stormed into the open space, loudly calling my name, and I felt the attention of the entire office shift toward me. "New girl," she said, locking eyes with me. "Where were you yesterday between 2 and 3? I tried to stay calm, but my chest tightened. "I was at a meeting with a client, as indicated in the planner," I replied, keeping my composure. She suddenly triumphantly shook a piece of paper. "You're lying." Her words struck like lightning. "The client called and said there was no meeting. You were probably stealing documents for the competitors." The whole office froze. It was as if I had become the center of a storm. The accusation was serious and I couldn't afford to be scared. I said firmly, "It's not true. I have a signed contract from that meeting." "Lie," Serafina replied, not hiding her satisfaction. "Mr. Smith has already ordered an internal investigation. Get ready for termination." That evening turned into a real test for me. Sitting in my apartment, I dialed Armin's number. "Can you check what's going on with the documents?" "I've already checked." Her voice sounded worried. "Monica, it's complete chaos. They're not just falsifying documents, they're preparing for a hostile takeover. I found drafts of contracts. If Mr. Kahir signs over the power of attorney to Mr. Smith, they'll sell the company off in pieces." I felt everything inside me tighten as this realization hit me. There was a heavy silence on the line. "Thanks, Armin, but don't tell anyone yet, okay?" "Of course, but what are you planning to do?" I smiled, knowing that the time had come to act. "Yes, I have a plan," I said, and the realization that it was time to prepare a surprise slowly began to weigh on me even more. The morning started with an urgent meeting. Mr. Smith, glowing like a spring ray, gathered everyone in the conference room. I immediately felt how much he was enjoying the attention. He broke into a smile, but it resembled more of a grimace. "Dear colleagues," his voice rang out across the room, "I am pleased to announce some great news. Our highly respected Mr. Kahir has decided to retire, and with that, big changes are coming." A worried murmur swept through the room, and I felt every eye turn toward me. I was sitting in the far corner, clutching a folder with the documents Armin and I had been working on all night. It felt like a bad omen. Mr. Smith continued, savoring the moment as if he enjoyed seeing the tension in the employees. "Well, the day after tomorrow, there will be an extraordinary shareholders meeting where the order for the transfer of management will be signed, and I will be the acting CEO." Serafina, standing behind him, didn't hide her satisfaction. She beamed and began handing out some papers. "Here's the company's reorganization plan," she said, casting a triumphant look at us. I took the offered document, but when I opened it, everything inside me flipped. The reorganization plan was nothing like it should have been. It looked more like a plan for plundering, mass layoffs, salary cuts, asset sales. And between the lines, I saw what Armin had mentioned, a scheme to siphon money through shell companies. "Any questions?" Mr. Smith asked, scanning the room with a sharp gaze. Silence hung in the air, but then Armin's hand rose. What about our long-term projects, the clients? Her voice was calm, but I could tell there was worry hiding behind it. Ah, dear Armin, Mr. Smith said with such disdain that I could almost feel the sting of his words on all of us. In the new company structure, I'm afraid there will be no place for outdated ways of working. Armin couldn't hold back and continued, So, you want to fire the most experienced employees? The young programmer Simon, who couldn't remain silent any longer, also intervened. Not fire, but optimize, Mr. Smith said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Serafina, like a hangman, didn't let anyone else object. And we'll start with the particularly talkative ones. Her words sounded like a sentence. After the meeting, I caught Armin in the hallway, unable to hold back my emotions. Did you see that? They're not even hiding it, I said, my anger building up. Yeah, she replied, nervously fiddling with the edges of her blouse. I checked all the documents. The scheme is clean. No one will understand anything unless someone intervenes. It will intervene. I clenched my fists, feeling the tension rise. I've prepared everything. Tomorrow, my father. You're who? A shrill voice came from behind, and I felt my whole body tense. We turned around. Standing just a few steps away was Serafina, holding a phone in her hand. On the screen was an open page of a gossip column with a picture of me and my father at a charity event. So, that's how it is. Her voice was full of mockery. So, Daddy sent a spy? Serafina, I can explain everything. I tried to stay calm, but the inner unease was growing with every passing second. You'll explain it to Mr. Smith. Serafina grabbed my elbow and dragged me into the office. The office of Mr. Smith was thick with smoke. He paced the room as usual, preparing for the upcoming confrontation. Serafina was almost choking on her accusations, unable to hide her fury. She's been here all along under a false name, spying, gathering intel. Silence, Smith interrupted her, his voice filled with cold menace. He stopped in front of me, his gaze intense and penetrating. So, you're Kahir's daughter. Well played. And what do you plan to do with the information you've gathered? I lifted my head proudly, trying not to reveal my inner anxiety. I wouldn't let them destroy everything my father had worked for his entire life. You can't allow that? He said with a smirk, and I felt his words pierce me to the core. Sweetheart, who's going to ask you? In a day, everything will be signed. And what about you? You've been working here on forged documents, haven't you? That's illegal, by the way. My voice trembled, but I didn't hold back. Are you threatening me? He leaned closer to me, his breath growing heavy. I'm giving you a choice, he said, and in his eyes I saw a cruel determination. You leave quietly, forget everything you've seen, and we forget about your little deception. Or, he didn't get a chance to finish. Suddenly the door swung open. On the threshold stood Mr. Kahir himself, and behind him was a pale Armin. I wasn't expecting this entrance, and my heart skipped a beat. Go ahead, I'm very interested, my father said, confidently stepping into the office. Behind him, several grim men in dark suits entered, silently taking positions by the door. It felt like the start of a major trial, and I realized that in this game, I was just one of the players. How long have you been planning your takeover of the business? My father asked, his voice cold with certainty. What takeover? Serafina shouted the word in desperation, but in her eyes I only saw confusion. It's all her. She pointed a finger at me. She snuck in here by deception, at your request. And she did the right thing, my father interrupted her, his words sharp and confident. Otherwise, I wouldn't have found out what you've turned the company into. He pulled a folder out of his briefcase and threw it onto the table with such force that everyone in the room froze. Here's the full report. Contract manipulations, kickbacks, employee harassment, personal accounts in the Caribbean. Shall I continue? His eyes met Smith's, and I could feel the tension rising. Mr. Smith barely managed to sit in the chair, trying to hide his nervousness, but his face only revealed a fragile mask of calm. Mr. Kahir, let's make a deal. His voice trembled from lack of confidence. About what? My father looked at him with a cold, detached gaze. About how you wanted to carve up the company I've been building for 30 years or even more. My father didn't break eye contact. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Or about how you threatened my daughter. His words sounded like the final chord. I didn't know, Smith mumbled, giving up. His voice was weak and confused. Serafina darted toward the door, but one of the men in suits blocked her path, signaling with a gesture for her to stay. One moment, one of them said, his voice stern. We need to ask you a few questions about the company's financial operations. I didn't sign anything, it's all him. Serafina, unabashed, pointed a finger at Smith. His face twisted in anger as he screamed, "Traitor!" After everything we had between us. It was like an explosion, but my father, not losing his composure, responded, I think you both will find time to discuss this with the financial control representatives. He reluctantly turned to the inspectors, casting a glance at the folders in their hands. For now, please leave and don't forget to return your passes. Once they were escorted out, my father turned to me, his gaze softening. His words surprised me, but I felt pride in them. You know, I'm proud of you. You've proven yourself to be a true leader. Thank you, Dad. I smiled, but couldn't hide my relief. But I couldn't have done it without help. I waved toward the door, where Armin was standing. Come in, meet my father officially, I said. My father smiled warmly at Armin. I've heard about your integrity and professionalism. I think we should discuss your promotion. An hour later, all the employees gathered again in the conference room. But the atmosphere was completely different. I felt the tension hanging in the air. My colleagues, as if standing under scrutiny, waited for what Mr. Kahir would say. He scanned the silent employees and his voice rang out decisively. I apologize for not noticing what was happening for so long. That will change, as will many other things. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt his confidence transfer to me. He continued, Let me introduce to you the new CEO of the company, Miss Camilla. A surprised murmur spread through the room. Everyone was shocked, and I noticed how people started realizing the changes. Armin was the first to applaud, and gradually the others followed her example. And also, my father continued, I'd like to introduce your new CFO, Miss Armin. I'm sure that together they will make the company stronger and fairer. Now, I knew each of them not by their papers, but by their real actions and deeds. I stepped forward and asked for silence, and the whole room fell still, listening to every word I said. Let's all together make this company a place where honesty, professionalism, and human values are cherished, where everyone can realize their full potential, where success is built not on intrigue, but on real work. Are you with me? The room literally exploded with applause. People stood up, and I felt my chest swell with pride. It was the moment when I realized that everything that had happened had ultimately led to this. That evening, sitting in my new office, I was going through the congratulatory messages that kept coming in. One of them was from Simon. He wrote, You know, all this month we've been betting on who you really are, and I bet on the director's daughter and won. I laughed, feeling relief and satisfaction sweep over me. Ahead of me lay a long road, full of interesting and important tasks, and I was ready for it.